11 Forgotten Current Conflicts, the wars the world has left behind. In an age of instant communication, where news travels across continents in seconds, it might seem impossible for any significant event to escape global attention. Yet, amidst the noise of major geopolitical tensions and high-profile conflicts, some wars continue to rage quietly, largely ignored by the international community. These forgotten conflicts are often rooted in deep-seated historical grievances, ethnic divisions, or resource disputes. But their invisibility on the world stage means they receive little media coverage, diplomatic intervention, or humanitarian aid. Welcome to One Good Fact. Today, we shed light on some of these overlooked battles, exploring why they persist and what can be done to address them. Conflict number 1. The conflict in Yemen, a forgotten war that continues to ravage lives. Did you know that the world's largest humanitarian crisis is happening right now, and most people don't even realize it? Imagine living in a country where bombs fall daily, clean water is scarce, and millions face starvation. Sounds like something out of a dystopian movie, right? But this nightmare is real. It's called the war in Yemen. Yemen has been torn apart by one of the deadliest conflicts of our time. What started as a power struggle between Houthi rebels and the government quickly spiraled into a full-blown proxy war involving regional heavyweights like Saudi Arabia and Iran. Since 2015, airstrikes have devastated cities, schools, hospitals, and homes. And let me tell you, the numbers are staggering. Over 377,000 deaths so far, many of them children. That's equivalent to wiping out an entire small city. So how did we get here? Well, Yemen was already one of the poorest countries in the Middle East before all hell broke loose. When the Houthis took over parts of the country in 2014, Saudi Arabia led a coalition to push them back. Fast forward 8 years, and what do we have? A never-ending cycle of violence fueled by international arms deals and political interests. Meanwhile, ordinary Yemenis are paying the ultimate price. Over 20 million people, two-thirds of the population, are struggling just to survive. They're drinking contaminated water because sanitation systems have collapsed. Kids are dying from diseases like cholera that should have been eradicated decades ago. But here's the kicker. Despite its scale, this conflict rarely makes headlines anymore. Why? Because other crises, like Ukraine, Gaza, or climate disasters, grab the spotlight. And when global attention fades, so does funding for aid programs. Did you know only half of the UN's $4 billion appeal for Yemen was met last year? Half. While diplomats occasionally sit down for peace talks, nothing sticks. Without sustained pressure, this war will drag on indefinitely. Now think about this. If more people knew about Yemen's plight, could they demand action? Could your voice help end this invisible tragedy? Stick around, because next, we'll dive into another forgotten conflict. One happening closer to home than you might expect. Conflict number 2, Central African Republics, CAR. Unending instability in a forgotten corner of Africa. What happens when a war rages for nearly a decade but barely anyone notices? Welcome to the Central African Republic, or CAR, a place where chaos reigns, yet silence blankets the outside world. Does that sound unbelievable? Trust me, it's true. Since 2013, CAR has been locked in a brutal civil war. Seleka rebels, mainly Muslim, seized control of the capital Bangui, sparking retaliation from Christian militias known as anti-Balaka. Entire communities were displaced, villages burned to the ground, and thousands killed. Even after signing a shaky peace deal in 2019, armed groups still hold sway over vast areas of the country. Today, almost 3 million people, out of a population of just 5 million, rely on humanitarian aid to survive. Why does this matter? For starters, CAR is rich in resources like gold and diamonds, but corruption and conflict mean these treasures benefit no one except warlords and foreign exploiters. Poverty runs deep here, with infrastructure crumbling and education practically non-existent, and because the region is so remote, few journalists venture there to report firsthand. It's like the perfect storm for invisibility, poverty, isolation, and a lack of strategic importance. Let's talk about the human cost for a moment. Picture being a child growing up in Central African Republic. You might wake up every day wondering if armed men will raid your village. Schools are closed, crops destroyed, and hunger is constant. Wouldn't it face unimaginable dangers, including gender-based violence? Yet, despite all this suffering, global powers shrugged their shoulders. The UN maintains a peacekeeping mission, sure, but without stronger backing, it's like trying to stop a flood with a sieve. Here's the thing, ignorance isn't bliss, it's deadly. If we ignore conflicts like CARs, we allow them to fester and spread. So what can be done? And what lessons can we learn from similar situations elsewhere? Stay tuned, because next, we'll explore another battle zone hidden in plain sight, Western Sahara. Conflict number 3, Western Sahara, Africa's last colony. What if I told you that one of the longest-running territorial disputes in modern history is happening right now, and most people have no idea? It's not in some far-off, obscure corner of the globe. It's in Africa. Welcome to Western Sahara, often referred to as Africa's last colony. Western Sahara has been under Moroccan occupation since 1975, when Spain pulled out and left the region in limbo. The indigenous Sahrawi people, represented by the Polisario Front, have been fighting for independence ever since. For decades, this conflict simmered on the back burner, but tensions exploded again in 2020 when Morocco launched military operations in the disputed territory. Today, a massive sand wall divides the region, with Moroccan forces controlling about 80% of the land and the Polisario Front holding the rest. Here's the kicker. Despite being recognized by the UN as a non-self-governing territory, Western Sahara remains largely ignored by the international community. Why? Because it doesn't directly threaten global stability or involve major powers like the US or China. Instead, it's a tug-of-war between Morocco, which claims sovereignty, and the Sahrawi, who wants self-determination. Meanwhile, thousands of Sahrawi live in refugee camps in neighboring Algeria, enduring harsh desert conditions while their homeland remains occupied. But here's what really hits hard. Imagine living your entire life without a country to call your own. That's the reality for the Sahrawi. They face repression if they stay in Moroccan-controlled areas, arrests, disappearances, and cultural erasure, or exile if they flee. And while the UN has tried to broker peace, talks have gone nowhere. Morocco benefits from exploiting Western Sahara's rich fishing waters and phosphate reserves, so why would they give it up? The Sahrawi, meanwhile, are left clinging to hope and resilience. So, what happens when a people's fight for freedom is drowned out by louder, flashier conflicts? Does silence equal surrender? Stick around, because next we're diving into another invisible war, one that's tearing apart Southeast Asia, Myanmar's internal strife. Conflict number 4, Myanmar, a nation torn apart. Picture this, a country that gained independence with dreams of unity and prosperity, but instead descended into chaos and bloodshed. Sounds tragic, right? Well, that's Myanmar, a nation grappling with multiple civil wars and ethnic persecution. And guess what? Most of us barely notice. Myanmar has been embroiled in violence since its independence in 1948, but things took a darker turn in 2021 when the military seized power in a coup. Overnight, democracy was crushed and mass protests erupted across the country. Security forces responded with brutal crackdowns, killing over 2,000 civilians and displacing hundreds of thousands more. Ethnic minority groups like the Rohingya, Kachin, Shan, and Karen have borne the brunt of this violence for decades, facing systematic discrimination and atrocities. Let's rewind for a moment. You might remember the Rohingya genocide in 2017, which shocked the world. Over 700,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh after being targeted by the military in what the UN called the textbook example of ethnic cleansing. But while the Rohingya crisis grabbed headlines briefly, the broader conflict in Myanmar faded into obscurity. Today, armed resistance movements are fighting back against the junta. But without international support, they're vastly outnumbered and outgunned. What makes this situation even worse is how isolated Myanmar is. The military regime controls information tightly, blocking journalists and cutting off internet access in rebel-held areas. This blackout means the world sees only fragments of the horror unfolding inside the country. Meanwhile, sanctions imposed by Western nations have done little to weaken the junta, which continues to profit from natural resources like jade and timber. For ordinary citizens, life is a daily struggle for survival amidst airstrikes, arbitrary arrests, and economic collapse. Now ask yourself, how can a nation heal when its wounds keep reopening? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel for Myanmar? Keep watching, because next we'll explore yet another forgotten tragedy, a young nation betrayed by its own leaders, South Sudan. Conflict number 5. South Sudan. Independence turned nightmare. When a country gains independence, it's supposed to be a moment of celebration, right? Freedom, hope, a fresh start. But what happens when independence turns into a nightmare? Enter South Sudan, the world's youngest nation, and arguably one of its most troubled. South Sudan declared independence from Sudan in 2011, cheered on by the international community. But just 2 years later, everything fell apart. A power struggle between President Salva Kiir and his former vice president, Riek Machar, spiraled into a devastating civil war. What started as a political dispute quickly morphed into an ethnic conflict, pitting Dinka and Nuer communities against each other. By the time a fragile peace deal was signed in 2018, nearly 400,000 people had died and millions were displaced. How did this happen? To understand South Sudan's plight, you need to look at its history. Decades of marginalization under Sudan left the region deeply impoverished and divided. When independence finally came, expectations were sky high, but so were the challenges. Corruption, tribal rivalries, and weak institutions made governing nearly impossible. Add in competition over oil revenues, the country's main source of income, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Fast forward to today, and the picture isn't much brighter. While the 2018 peace agreement stopped large-scale fighting, localized violence persists, and implementation of the deal is sluggish at best. Millions of South Sudanese rely on food aid to survive, and inflation has soared to astronomical levels. For many, the dream of a better future feels like a cruel joke. And sadly, the international community's initial enthusiasm for supporting South Sudan has given way to fatigue, leaving the country to fend for itself. So, where do we go from here? Can South Sudan rise from the ashes, or will it remain trapped in this cycle of despair? These questions matter, not just for South Sudan, but for all of us, because every forgotten conflict is a reminder of our shared humanity and responsibility. Conflict number 6, the forgotten conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, a frozen war that's heating up. Have you ever heard of a place where two nations claim the same land, and the people caught in the middle are left to fend for themselves? Welcome to Nagorno-Karabakh, a region that's been at the center of one of the world's most complex and overlooked conflicts. Spoiler alert, it's not frozen anymore, it's boiling over. Nagorno-Karabakh is a mountainous enclave nestled between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Despite being internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, it's home to a majority ethnic Armenian population. For decades, this mismatch has fueled tensions, erupting into full-blown war in the early 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed. A ceasefire was brokered in 1994, but peace never truly took hold. In 2020, a brutal 6-week conflict reignited, leaving thousands dead and displacing tens of thousands more. And guess what? It's still simmering today. Here's the backstory. Nagorno-Karabakh has always been a flashpoint. During Soviet times, the region was given to Azerbaijan as an autonomous oblast, despite its Armenian majority population. When the USSR dissolved, both Armenia and Azerbaijan claimed sovereignty over the area. Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh declared independence, leading to a bloody war that ended with Armenian forces controlling the region and surrounding territories. But Azerbaijan never gave up its claim, and with backing from Turkey and advanced weaponry, they launched a devastating offensive in 2020. Fast forward to now, and the situation is dire. After Azerbaijan regained control of key areas in 2020, the fragile status quo shattered. Thousands of ethnic Armenians were forced to flee their homes, abandoning villages and towns overnight. Those who stayed faced blockades, shortages of food and medicine, and constant fear of renewed violence. Meanwhile, international efforts to mediate have stalled, leaving locals to wonder if anyone cares about their plight. Did you know that just last year, Azerbaijan imposed a blockade on the Lachin corridor, the only road connecting Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia, cutting off supplies and deepening the humanitarian crisis? It's haunting, isn't it? How entire populations can be erased from maps and memories while the world looks away. But here's the question. What happens when history repeats itself and no one steps in to stop it? Keep watching, because next, we'll explore another forgotten battlefield, one that stretches across borders and generations: Kashmir. Conflict number 7. Kashmir, a paradise lost in conflict. What do you picture when you hear the word Kashmir? Stunning mountains, serene lakes, and lush valleys, right? Now imagine that same paradise turned into a battleground where families live under curfews, soldiers patrol streets, and dreams of freedom are crushed daily. This is the reality of Kashmir, a conflict so old it feels like it's been forgotten by time itself. Kashmir, a region split between India, Pakistan, and China, has been disputed since the partition of British India in 1947. Both India and Pakistan claim the territory in full, but control it only in part. Decades of skirmishes, wars, and insurgencies have left the region scarred. In 2019, things took a darker turn when India revoked Article 370 of its constitution, stripping Kashmir of its special autonomous status. Overnight, communication blackouts, mass detentions, and heavy military presence became the norm. Let's break it down. Kashmiris have long felt caught between two giants, neither of which seems willing to listen to their voices. For years, separatist movements have demanded independence or unification with Pakistan, leading to crackdowns by Indian security forces. Human rights organizations report widespread abuses, extrajudicial killings, torture, and enforced disappearances. But these allegations rarely make headlines outside the region. Meanwhile, Pakistan accuses India of occupying Kashmir, while India blames Pakistan for fueling militancy. Caught in the crossfire are ordinary Kashmiris who simply want to live without fear. Think about this. How would you feel if your phone stopped working, your internet disappeared, and your family couldn't contact loved ones for months? That's exactly what happened in 2019 when India imposed a communications blackout in Kashmir, the longest ever recorded in a democracy. Schools shut down, businesses collapsed, and hospitals struggled to function. Even now, restrictions remain, stifling dissent and silencing opposition. Yet, for all the suffering, global leaders have largely stayed silent, treating Kashmir as a bilateral issue rather than a human rights catastrophe. So, what does it take for the world to wake up? When will Kashmiris get the justice and the peace they deserve? These questions linger unanswered, but don't go anywhere, because next, we'll dive into another hidden tragedy: the ongoing turmoil in Ethiopia's Tigray region. Stay tuned, it's a story you won't want to miss. Conflict number 8, Ethiopia's Tigray crisis, a nation at war with itself. What happens when a country tears itself apart from the inside? Imagine a nation once celebrated for its rich history and cultural diversity descending into chaos, with millions trapped in a humanitarian nightmare. This isn't fiction, it's Ethiopia, and the war in Tigray is one of the deadliest conflicts you've probably never heard of. In November 2020, fighting erupted between Ethiopia's federal government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, a regional political party that had dominated Ethiopian politics for decades before being sidelined. What began as a domestic power struggle quickly escalated into a full-blown civil war, drawing in neighboring Eritrea and other regional factions. The result? A humanitarian catastrophe so severe that it's been described as hell on earth by aid workers. To understand this crisis, we need to rewind. Ethiopia is a diverse nation made up of over 80 ethnic groups, each with its own language, culture, and history. For years, tensions simmered beneath the surface, exacerbated by economic inequality, political marginalization, and historical grievances. When Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, promising reform and unity, many hoped for change. Instead, his decision to sideline the TPLF and consolidate power sparked outrage in Tigray, setting the stage for conflict. Now let's talk about the human cost. Since the war began, thousands have died. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands, and millions have been displaced. Reports of atrocities abound: massacres, sexual violence, and widespread looting. Eritrean troops, allied with Ethiopia's government, have been accused of some of the worst abuses. Meanwhile, a blockade has left Tigray isolated, with food, medicine, and fuel in critically short supply. Did you know that at one point, 90% of the population in Tigray face severe hunger? That's nearly 6 million people staring down starvation. And yet, despite occasional ceasefires and peace talks, the violence continues. Even worse, the international community has struggled to respond effectively. Sanctions and condemnations have done little to stop the bloodshed, and humanitarian access remains limited. For Tigrayans, survival is a daily battle against forces far beyond their control. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? How do you rebuild trust in a country torn apart by betrayal and bloodshed? And what lessons can we learn from Ethiopia's descent into darkness? Don't leave just yet, because next, we're heading to another forgotten corner of the world, Colombia, where a decades-old conflict still lingers in the shadows. Conflict number 9. Colombia. Peace agreements, but no peace. You've probably heard of Colombia's infamous drug cartels or its lush coffee plantations. But did you know that one of Latin America's longest-running conflicts is still simmering there today? Spoiler: signing a peace deal doesn't always mean the war is over. For over half a century, Colombia was ravaged by a brutal civil war involving guerrilla groups like the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, paramilitaries, and government forces. In 2016, a historic peace agreement was signed between the Colombian government and the FARC, hailed as a monumental step toward ending the violence. But here's the catch: not everyone laid down their arms. Dissident factions of the FARC rejected the deal, and other armed groups, like the National Liberation Army, ELN, and criminal organizations, continue to wreak havoc across the country. Let's unpack this. The roots of Colombia's conflict go deep, stemming from land inequality, political exclusion, and the lucrative cocaine trade. While the peace accord brought hope, it also exposed cracks in implementation. Many rural areas remain neglected, leaving communities vulnerable to exploitation by armed groups. These groups fight for control of coca-growing regions, illegal mining operations, and trafficking routes, perpetuating cycles of violence and displacement. Here's what keeps me up at night. Despite the peace agreement, violence against social leaders and activists has surged. Indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, who bore the brunt of the conflict, are still targeted. In 2023 alone, dozens of human rights defenders were murdered. And let's not forget the millions of internally displaced Colombians who live in limbo, unable to return home. Meanwhile, the government struggles to balance demobilization efforts with growing public frustration over insecurity. But here's the twist. Unlike other conflicts, Colombia's plight often gets overshadowed by more sensational stories elsewhere. Drug kingpins and Netflix dramas grab attention, but the everyday realities of Colombians trying to rebuild their lives fade into the background. So, what does real peace look like in a country scared by decades of war? Can Colombia find a way forward, or will the ghosts of its past keep haunting its future? Stick around, because next, we'll explore another overlooked battleground, Cameroon, where a silent war is tearing apart an entire region. Conflict number 10. Cameroon's Anglophone crisis. A silent war in plain sight. Can you imagine waking up one day to find your language banned, your school shut down, and your community under attack, all because of who you are? This isn't dystopian fiction. It's happening right now in Cameroon, where a hidden war threatens to tear the country apart. Cameroon is divided linguistically. The majority Francophone population dominates the government, while a minority Anglophone population resides in two western regions. In 2016, protests erupted when English-speaking teachers and lawyers demanded greater autonomy and recognition. The government responded with force, sparking an armed separatist movement demanding independence for Ambazonia, as the Anglophone regions call themselves. Since then, the conflict has escalated into a brutal insurgency, with both sides accused of atrocities. This crisis didn't come out of nowhere. After gaining independence from Britain and France in 1960, Cameroon adopted a federal system that gave equal status to both linguistic groups. But in 1972, the government abolished federalism, centralizing power and sidelining Anglophones. Decades of resentment boiled over into open rebellion, fueled by systemic discrimination and neglect. Today, civilians bear the brunt of the violence. Schools have become battlegrounds, villages have been burned to the ground, and hundreds of thousands have fled their homes. Here's the chilling part: the world barely notices. Despite reports of mass killings, kidnappings, and scorched earth tactics, global media coverage remains sparse. Humanitarian organizations face immense challenges accessing affected areas due to insecurity and government restrictions. Meanwhile, children grow up without education, farmers lose their livelihoods, and families live in constant fear. Did you know that since 2017, over 6,000 people have died in this conflict? Yet, it barely registers on the global radar. It's sobering, isn't it? How easily entire populations can be erased from view when no one speaks up. So, what will it take to bring peace to Cameroon and justice to those who suffered in silence? Keep watching, because every story matters, especially the ones we don't hear. Together, we can shine a light on these forgotten wars. Conflict number 11. The DRC's overlooked war with M23 rebels, a conflict fueling global crisis. What if I told you that a rebel group in Africa is bankrolling its war by stealing minerals critical to your smartphone and electric car, and the world is barely paying attention? Welcome to the Democratic Republic of Congo's, DRC, hidden war with the M23 rebels, a conflict that's as lucrative as it is deadly. In early 2025, M23 rebels launched a brazen offensive in eastern DRC, seizing control of 2 strategic towns in North Kivu province. Just weeks later, they escalated tensions by claiming to capture the key city of Goma, a hub for trade and humanitarian aid. These advances marked a dramatic escalation in a conflict that has displaced millions and left over 700 civilians dead in a single month. This isn't the first time M23 has shaken the region. The group, allegedly backed by Rwanda, first emerged in 2012 and has since exploited the DRC's chaotic post-colonial legacy. After independence in 1960, the DRC became a battleground for power, with ethnic divisions, corruption, and competition over its vast mineral wealth, fueling decades of violence. Today, M23 thrives by controlling mining zones like Rubaya, where they extract coltan and gold, minerals essential for tech and green energy industries. The UN estimates they rake in $300,000 monthly from illegal mining. But here's the catch. This war isn't just about territory. It's about control of resources that power the global economy. And M23's grip on mineral-rich areas lets them fund their rebellion while civilians suffer. Villages are burned, women are assaulted, and children are recruited as soldiers. Despite a UN peacekeeping mission, the Congolese army struggles to push back, and international attention remains minimal. Why? Because the conflict is framed as local or ethnic, not a global threat. Yet the DRC supplies 70% of the world's cobalt. If this war disrupts supply chains, your next phone or EV battery could be tied to this crisis. And there you have it. 11 current forgotten conflicts. If you are touched by this series, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with friends.